Hello, my name is Sarah Florence Davidson, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Potlatch's Pedagogy, Reflections on Methodology. I'm recording this presentation on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Stalo people. And this is a photograph of the sky and the trees from one of my walks last summer. I spent a lot of time during COVID walking around on the land and looking at the sky, and I found a lot of peace and was very, very grateful to be here on this territory at this time. My Haida name is Anjaku Sanlans, which means killer whale woman of the dawn. I belong to the Yakut Janas clan from Haida Gwaii. And my father is Robert Davidson. He is of Haida and Tlingit ancestry. His Haida name is Otsandlans, which means eagle of the dawn. And he belongs to the Ch'oth clan. My mother, Susan Davidson, asks to be identified as a colonizer when I do these introductions. She was adopted by my great-grandmother into the Yakut Janas clan so that my brother and I would have a place in the community, in the Haida community. That's because the Haida people are matrilineal, which means we follow our mothers. And so that's how I became part of that clan. You'll see here, this is an image of Haida Gwaii, just for those folks who may not be familiar with where it is. It's on the northwest coast of what is currently known as British Columbia, and you'll see that it's just west of Prince Rupert. I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. And I co-authored Potlatch's Pedagogy, Learning Through Ceremony with my father, Robert Davidson. Recently, we also published two of a series of 4 picture books, the Skata Stories series. And those stories focused on Indigenous pedagogies and intergenerational learning. So the first 2 came out in September of 2021, and the second 2 will come out in September of 2022. I have a PhD in literacy education from UBC, and I also have 9 years experience, give or take, and working in rural BC and Yukon, and I worked mainly with grades 6 to 12, but I also worked with some adult learners. If you would like to connect with me more, I have a contact form on my website, sarahflorence.ca. You'll notice there's no H. And you can also find me on social media, Twitter and Instagram at Sarah F. Davidson, again with no H. I wanted to begin today with a quote that I found to be really, really useful and resonated a lot with the work that I do, specifically as I work with stories. And this is from Linda Smith. Each individual story is powerful, but the point about the stories is not that they simply tell a story or tell a story simply. These new stories contribute to a collective story in which every Indigenous person has a place. For many Indigenous writers, stories are ways of passing down the beliefs and values of a culture in the hope that the new generations will treasure them and pass the story down further. The story and the storyteller both serve to connect the past with the future, one generation with the other, the land with the people, and the people with the story. So, although this is about Potlatch's pedagogy actually began several years before the book came out. And it began with a comprehensive exam. So at UBC, when I was completing my degree there, one of the options to do for the comprehensive exam was 3 papers. And so that's what I chose to do. And one of my papers focused on Indigenous pedagogies. And so what I did for that paper is that I did, some of the interviews with my father. And sorry, I'm having some trouble advancing things. So when I talk about when I talk about the beginnings of this project, I frame it with this idea that I had just finished all of my coursework in my doctoral program. And I realized that there were a lot of things that I had hoped to learn that I had not. And so I frame it as, what I did not learn in school. And what I found in 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 sort of going through my doctoral work, I learned so many things, but I had come to my PhD with a question about how to better support Indigenous students. And I found that as I finished my coursework, I didn't really have the answers that I had hoped for. And so what I decided to do, and it's documented in Potlatch's Pedagogy, is I decided to go and ask my father some of these questions, and in the hopes that he would have some insights into what it was that contributed to him completing school. And so one of the things that happens when you're doing research, as all of you know, when you're doing research with a post-secondary institution, is that you have to complete something called ethics. And it was really interesting for me because I had had many of these conversations with my father before I began my doctoral work. Even before we began the project, we had had these conversations about things that he had learned outside of school. We'd had conversations about him completing high school. But the moment that I had sort of decided that I wanted to embark on this research journey with him, it became a research project, and it meant that I had to complete these ethics forms. And so I'll share with you, I decided to share these in the presentation just because I think it's an interesting, perhaps provocation for conversations about ethics, specifically when we're doing this kind of work, when we're doing Indigenous research. And so this is the consent form, and I'll just read you some of the excerpts from the consent form. And so there were a couple things. One is that I had to fill out the ethics form, and something that has always remained with me is a question about, what qualified me to do this particular research, and sort of filling out like that we belong to the same community, we belong to the same family, we had similar kind of understandings, that he had been responsible for bringing me up with the protocols that I would then be expected to use in the conversations that we had. So anytime you're filling out ethics, you please feel free to think back on that. If the questions seem, maybe difficult to answer or difficult to think about, you can imagine me answering those questions in connection to speaking to my father. And so here's the consent form, and yes, my father did sign it. And I just pulled, as I say, some key quotes. So, you're being invited to take part in this research because of your unique educational experience. I am interested in learning more about how traditional Haida pedagogical practices influence academic success in mainstream schooling. I hope that this study will help me learn more about how to use Haida pedagogical practices to help Aboriginal students who are struggling in school. If you have any concerns or complaints about your rights as a research participant and/or your experiences while participating in this study, contact the Research Participant Complaint Line in the UBC Office of Research Ethics. Taking part in this study is entirely up to you. You have the right to refuse to participate in this study. If you decide to take part, you may choose to pull out at any time without giving a reason and without any negative impact. Your signature below indicates that you have received a copy of this consent form for your own records. Your signature indicates that you consent to participate in this study. My apologies for the flipping around. I seem to be having trouble with my mouse here, so I apologize for that. So the questions that I was interested in initially before, at this phase with my comprehensive exams were specifically what experiences in my father's life contributed to his academic success in school, what can be learned about pedagogy from my father's stories of learning experiences outside of school. So although at the very beginning, I was sort of approaching the project as, sort of looking at my father as a participant and myself as a researcher, we really did come to a place of working together, and to working together is sort of a short form for the name of um, the image on the cover of Potlatch's Pedagogy. And so although I had these sort of, I would say, beginnings that were solidly rooted in a maybe more Western view of research, we really did come to this place where we were working together. And I was really, really grateful for the learning that happened that led me to that place where we were able to be much more collaborative. And by the time we got to Potlatch's Pedagogy, we were really more collaborating as opposed to kind of researcher and participant. So I'd like to read this quote by Margaret Kovach because I feel it also kind of sets the tone in terms of the work that we were doing together. Knowing the storyteller as an active agent within a relational world situated in a particular time and context is pivotal in gaining insight into the story being told. Because oral stories are born of connections within the world and are recounted relationally, stories braid the past, present, and future generations together. And I see these, even though they're right next to each other, I see these as kind of two separate ideas. And in the first, I worked in the book to try and provide enough context to be able to understand the story that I was sharing of my father's. And in the second part, I really, one of the outcomes of this project was this sort of connection I had to the past as a result of talking to my father and learning more about the elders that he was, the knowledge that he was sharing with me from them. We were existing in this present experience. And there is this recognition when we write books or when we write texts that it will continue on into the future. And it is, it is my hope, at least I won't speak on behalf of my father, it is my hope that this book will continue to contribute to future generations. So this is a photograph of my father and I in his studio, and I include this photograph just to give you a sense of where it was that we did this work. So it was really important for me to go to my father. So I went to his studio so that he wasn't having to drive somewhere to speak to me. I also found that it contributed to the quality of our conversations for him to be in a place that was comfortable to him and familiar to him. So I believe that helped us to have much richer conversations. And so the other part was that I would often bring food with me to offer to him, and I would work around his schedule. I didn't pay him because I also recognize I am his daughter, and one of the things that he talked about being a benefit or something that he got out of the work that we did together was he was really excited by the fact that I was asking these questions and that he was able to share the knowledge with me. And so I include this here just so you can have a sense of where the work took place, or where those conversations took place. And the process that we went through was that I would go and I would interview him. I had questions that I asked, and then he would answer them. I would go away. I would transcribe the interviews. I would then share them back with him, and he would kind of change things or expand on things or correct things. And then we would continue on with the conversation. And we sort of continued on until this, I want to say a natural kind of breaking point, but there was clearly another place for us to take our conversation. So we ended up having to pause, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. And this is a photograph of the cover image, and it's Sleitstad Swanson, which is a bow and arrow or two working together. And a little tidbit of information, when my father talks about the book, he calls it kind of two working together. And I sort of see that the title was kind of mine and the image was his. And so when he talks about this work, that's generally how he describes it. When I finished the comprehensive exam, I did try and publish it. So I submitted it to the Canadian Journal of Education, and they did accept it. And so the article that emerged from that comprehensive exam was called "Make Your Mind Strong: My Father's Insights into Academic Success." And you'll see here that they were the beginning of those SCOTA principles. So from the article, there were these headings: learning is authentic, learning involves making a contribution, learning occurs through observation, learning involves curiosity, learning involves aspects of spirituality and protocol, the power of the mind, the importance of history and stories, the importance of relationships, the importance of recognizing and encouraging strengths. And so when we kind of paused, in order, and I've described this fully in the book, but in order for us to come up with some of these principles, or with all of the principles, my father told me lots of different stories. And so he would tell me those stories, and I would identify the themes, and that's where these principles came from. And again, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But mainly what happened is we sort of had this conversation about learning experiences. And then my father started to segue into conversations about ceremonial knowledge. And at that point, we had to pause because I had to continue on with my schooling and move into my research. And so at that moment, we kind of paused, and I had sort of intended at one point to come back to and write a second article that covered ceremonial knowledge. And that was sort of the intention at the time. This is a photograph that was taken at the Gaisla or Potlatch that was hosted by my father and my stepmother, Terry Lynn Williams Davidson, in Heidelberg in 2018. And I included here just as a reminder that the idea for the book emerged from being at one of these potlatches. It was the one in 2016. And this idea that there is so much potential for learning that occurs in these kinds of experiences, in these ceremonies. And so it wasn't this particular potlatch that I had that moment of really understanding how my father was using potlatch as a pedagogical tool. And I don't mean that in a way to diminish the potlatch, but just it was quite, in my mind, a really sophisticated way to educate our family, our community. And so I just wanted to include this here as a reminder that the potlatch still is practiced today, and it's not something of the past. And so I'll transition now into the actual book. I have no idea why it's changing. I don't know if it's showing you a small little rectangle, little sneak preview of the next slide, but that's what's happening. So after the dissertation, when my father and I talked about, I went to him and I asked him if he'd be willing to kind of pick up where we had left off. And he was really interested in doing that. And so we started up again, and we started talking about the pole raising. And that's where this part of, this is where Potlatch's pedagogy really began. And so in that book, you'll notice that the SCOTA principles are a little different than what they were in Make Your Mind Strong, but that chapter 2 is really from that article that was published in the Canadian Journal of Education. So the SCOTA principles, they emerged for me as a result of kind of sitting with them and thinking about them. And I had a conversation with Dr. Nikki Yee about the SCOTA principles and Indigenous pedagogies more generally. And through the work that I did with her, I had these opportunities to really reflect on those principles. And so that's how they came to kind of be clustered in the way that they are. And so I really was thinking about, how did those ideas come together? And so learning emerges from strong relationships, authentic experiences, and curiosity. Learning occurs through observation, contribution, and recognizing and encouraging strength. Learning honors the power of the mind, history and story, and aspects of spirituality and protocol. And this is not to say that I think this is sort of the end of the line for the Scott principles. I believe that they may continue to evolve and change in the way, as my knowledge and my understanding of the principles and those stories continues to evolve. So with Potlatch's pedagogy, you'll notice that my questions shifted a little bit. So for the book, I was really interested in how do we relearn ancestral knowledge and protocols when attempts to assimilate us have resulted in the forced dormancy of such knowledge. How do we transmit this knowledge to our communities and future generations once it has been collectively remembered and relearned? What are the implications of these understandings for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in contemporary mainstream educational environments? And so, as I mentioned before, with this sort of transition into Potlatch's pedagogy, I moved out of this kind of researcher participant role and into a much more collaborative role with my father. And I'll outline that a bit more as we go along. I wanted to also note that a lot of my insights have come when I slow down. And so Dr. Joanne Archibald talks about the importance of slowing down to live with stories. And I have really learned so much more when I've been able to take the time. Often when I'm walking, these ideas will come to me or insights will come to me. And I find that it's mostly when things are quiet, when I have the opportunity to just sort of think quietly about something, that I have those insights. And so I wanted to just kind of draw attention to that as part of the process that I went through to come to better understand my father's stories, and also how my father was teaching using Indigenous pedagogies and intergenerational learning. So Dr. Archibald talks about the importance of becoming story ready. And so for those of you, I'm sure all of you are familiar with her work. She has the 7 Indigenous story work principles that she outlines in her book, Indigenous Story Work. I highly recommend it if you have not had a chance to look at it. But she has these 7 principles that she talks about, and she divides them in this more recent article into this becoming story ready. And then she also talks about working with the stories. And so in becoming story ready, she includes respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. And so the connections that I make with these ideas in the work that I did is, with regard to respect, the deep listening that had to happen. When I was working with my father, it was really important that I stay focused on what he was saying, and I couldn't be distracted. I really needed to give him my full attention in order to be able to understand and kind of make sense of all of the information that he was sharing with me. There was a responsibility and I speak about accuracy. I definitely had a responsibility to make sure that what I was sharing was accurate. In terms of reverence, I treated the stories, I sort of talk about holding the stories gently. The stories that he shared with me, I saw them as gifts that he was sharing with me. And I was really, really grateful for his willingness to share the knowledge with me. And for me, part of my responsibility was to treat these stories with the utmost respect and to make sure that they were taken care of. And with regard to reciprocity, Dr. Archibald talks about this idea of giving back by sharing with others to ensure that the knowledge continues. And so that resonates with the experience I had with my father, in terms of he has this belief that, again, what I talked about in the book, of the importance of not hoarding knowledge, but sharing with other people. And so I was excited to read in this article, this idea of, being able to, we're giving back by sharing with others to ensure that this knowledge continues to survive. And so I think about the kind of the history, and so why I had access to this knowledge is because elders during the potlatch prohibition made sure that this knowledge was shared orally. And eventually my father that the information was shared with my father. And I see this as the contribution, the way that I'm able to give back. Another note, something that I should mention, is that more so in Potlatch's pedagogy, there was this tension that I experienced between sort of, my father, as a father to a daughter, my father was sharing information to me as a member of his family, as his daughter, but he was also sharing information with me as this kind of researcher. And so there were a lot of times when I had to navigate that and determine, is he sharing this with me for sort of my own knowledge and to be able to better understand my family, or is this being shared for a broader audience? And so just keeping in mind that as Indigenous researchers, we will often find ourselves in those situations, especially if we're working with communities, where we have to kind of navigate whether something is being shared with us as an individual or being shared for the purpose of sharing more broadly. And so when we're thinking about this reciprocity, we want to think about making sure that what we're sharing with others is okay for us to share. So when I defended my dissertation, I was really fortunate that Dr. Archibald was one of my, she was on my committee, and so it meant that she asked me questions at my defense. And one of the questions that she asked me was about how, and I'm paraphrasing here, how could the Indigenous storywork principles be more accessible? And I will admit, the first time I read her book, I had sort of hoped that there would be a chapter on each one of the principles. And sorry, I forgot to advance here. I had hoped that there would be, I had hoped there would be a chapter on each one of the principles. And because there wasn't, I really had to sit with her work for a long time. I actually went through and identified, I had all 7 of the principles, and I kind of read each little bit that she said about each of the principles. I put it together, and I felt that I had to work really hard to make meaning from her book. And I think that that's sort of what she was asking me about when she asked me that question. But I will say that as a result of the way that she told me and taught me, or taught the readers about those principles, made me need to engage and make my own meaning from that experience. And so I felt that I got so much more out of the book as a result of that deeper engagement that I needed to make in order to be able to learn from everything that she shared. And so I'm going to share this part of the presentation in that spirit. And I would like to just make it really clear that my mind, as I said in the book, works really well in frameworks. And so when I'm trying to make meaning or make sense of something, the first thing I'll do is take a piece of paper and, kind of try and map it out. And so I'm sharing my brain with you, not for the purpose of saying that this is the way that we should be working with Indigenous story work, but to offer a way that I thought through working with Indigenous story work. And I would, so I offer it as an example, and I would encourage you to do your own work to make meaning from that text based on your own knowledge and experiences. This is definitely not to suggest that you should replicate this. I'm just sharing it as an example, because when I was a graduate student, I thought it would be I often really appreciated any examples that I could have. So, making meaning from the story. And so Um, as you know, the Scada principles came from this series of stories. And I kind of joke to say that I went to my dad kind of hoping that he'd tell me the top 10 things I could do to support Indigenous students. And he told me this series of stories. And initially I was a little kind of frustrated because I didn't really know what to do with those stories. But I then started to work with them a bit more and kind of started noticing themes. And so the process that I followed here is that I listened to the story, I made meaning from the story, I identified themes in my learning. And so um, one of the things that I did is I actually transcribed all of the interviews, and I see that as part of the process for me to make meaning. When you're typing and really listening to things, for me, that was a beginning part of the process. So it was really important for me in terms of doing the analysis that I actually do my own transcription. And so then I shared what I heard with my father. I shared what I learned with my father. I then listened to my father, and then I reflected on my new learning. And I've put over here a little circle of kind of, this idea, because the way it's laid out, it could be that it's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it really wasn't. I kind of, when I arrived here into these bold sections, I found that I could circle here for quite a while as I continued. And it wasn't until my father said, yes, that's okay. This reflects what my intention was, that I would kind of move on to this last step where I would share what I have learned with others. And I always had permission from my father. And sometimes this required a bit of intuition, because there were times when he would I would watch his body language, and when he was reading something, or so even though he wasn't saying, no, you can't share this, when I asked him, like, oh, maybe I should take that out, he would say yes. And so just being really attentive to the storyteller, in this case my father, was really, really an important part of the process. So I wanted to emphasize that. So in terms of just kind of laying it out for exactly what I did, and you'll see that I replicated these steps: listen to the story, make meaning from the story, identify themes in my learning, share what I heard with my father, share what I learned with my father, listen to my father, reflect on my new learning, share what I have learned with others with permission. So those were the steps. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see what I actually did. And so I listened and audio recorded the conversations with my father, which included the stories. I transcribed the conversations, which added depth to my listening and learning from the stories. I reflected on the stories and reviewed them on audio and in the transcripts, looking for themes in my father's learning experiences. I shared the transcripts with my father so he could read through them. I shared what I understood from the transcripts with my father during our next conversation. Excuse me. He would add, remove, I apologize, I got a typo there. He would add, remove, or clarify information from the transcript, and he would respond to, confirm, or correct what I had shared about my understanding. I reflected on our conversations, noting any new understandings that emerged, and that's where it sort of goes back up to the top, because if I come to a new understanding, it's really important that I go back and clarify that with my father, that I don't just kind of go rogue and share, go ahead and share information that I haven't verified with my father. So those are the steps, and this is specifically connected to the Scada principles. I thought that they might be a useful example to just sort of take you through in terms of that process. And again, I share this as an example. And it's, I would say, a really, really simplification of the process for the purpose of sharing. It's definitely not a linear process. And, there were times when I would kind of jump from step to step, and then I'd have an insight and kind of go back. But I've really oversimplified it for the purpose of just sort of sharing this example with you. So then I come back to the last three principles, working with stories, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And holism had to do with the relationships between me, my family, my community, and nation. And so an example of that is even just the naming of the stories. And so the naming of the principles. And so the principles are called SCADA principles. They're not called the Haida principles. And that's because I did not consult with the Haida Nation. I didn't work with any other elders or any other people from the community to hear their stories. These are solely based on my father's stories. And so in doing this work, it was really important to me to conduct myself in a respectful and honorable way, to be able to maintain those relationships with my father, maintain the relationships with my family and my community and my nation. Interrelatedness, cultural information, and other important contextual information. And so you'll notice in the book, I did try and include as much information as possible so that the reader could have a better understanding of the information that was being shared. And so those connections, those you'll definitely notice those intersections and connections that happen. And synergy is when I was doing my dissertation, and I created an ethical framework based on Dr. Archibald's Indigenous Storywork principles, and I came to synergy, and I really struggled with it because it cannot be captured. It's not like we can do synergy. It's something that just happens. And so I would say that those previous kind of frameworks and lists, they don't take into account the synergy. And so I love the definition that that Dr. Archibald provides in this article from 2020, which is using Indigenous stories for personal, research, educational, or other professional purposes creates a new action or use for them. And that definitely captures synergy. And so there were those moments that I was sort of describing previously where it wasn't that I was following any of the steps, but ideas just came to me. And I, knowledge just sort of opened up to me as a result of doing this work, as a result of reflecting. And so it's not something I can capture. I feel, it's definitely important to mention, but it's not possible to just sort of do it on demand. It's about being open. And I think of those initial principles about being story ready. I feel like synergy happens when we have prepared ourselves and we are ready for more learning. And so I wanted to kind of emphasize that and come back to specifically talking about synergy and the idea of making things new. And for me, one of the clear examples in this, in the work that my father and I did together, was that moment at the Potlatch, where I was sort of sitting surrounded by family and community. There were dancers, there was singing happening, and I looked around me and had this moment of saying, oh, okay, my dad is using Potlatch as pedagogy. And so I believe that was part of that. And when I was doing my dissertation, I did use one of our traditional dances as a metaphor for some of the work that I was doing. And in that experience, I came to understand the dance more. I came to understand research more as a result of the two of them. And I attribute that to the same thing, this synergy. And so that I would say that's an example of these moments of understanding that don't fit in the framework. They don't fit in the cycle. They're just these moments where things come together and just make sense. In terms of the language of a number of SCADA principles and my continued learning about the SCADA principles, I feel like that reflects these moments of synergy, and the deeper understandings that I have are a result of those moments. And I just love the translation, make things new. And I really feel like I have a new perspective on what I'm learning as a result of Synergy. So I wanted to end with this quote from Dr. Archibald. Through experience, critical reflection, and discussion, I learned that the story learner is implicitly given space and time to make story meaning with and through the story at this juncture. The story may have stopped, but this does not mean that the story is finished. And so I guess I will end by saying that I'm definitely open to the new learning that will emerge from, and I continue to learn more and more as a result of the book being out in the world. But even the picture books, I'm really excited about all of the learning that happens. I'm excited about the fact that it's not finished, and that we will. I love having conversations with folks. So if you'd like to discuss this further, please feel free to reach out. And I'm going to stop there. So thank you so much for joining me. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Joanne Archibald. She has been an incredible impact on so much of the work that I do. And I'm so grateful to constantly be able to learn so much from her. And there's so much in here that is a result of the learning from her. How